My blood is boiling over this. I'm so angry. Of course, it wasn't the New York Times. It wasn't only the New York Times. The Post has got a great piece from last June, I think it was, where they just ripped these folks to shreds because they are too. A New York Times writer was blaming partisan politics for the lab leak cover-up. There was a piece by an op-ed person back then. They ran a molecular biologist essay, Alina Chan, back then talking about this. So this person blamed partisan politics for covering up that this was a lab leak. And the Post pointed out at the time, it wasn't just New York Times. It was CNN. It was MSNBC. They called the lab leak a debunked conspiracy theory. NPR falsely asserted, quote, scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. Reading here from the New York Post again, June of 24. Social media companies outright censored lab leak claims. Facebook banned a Post opinion column by Stephen Mosier for speculating on the possibility that it was a lab leak. They write as recently as Monday, again in June of 24, an AP story bizarrely claimed, quote, many scientists believe the virus most likely emerged in nature, and, quote, there's no scientific information backing the lab leak explanation. It's unbelievable how we were gaslit. And the New York Times wants to pretend that it was just the experts. It 100% was the experts, but that the media had no role, that they were not complicit. But they were fully complicit. And Glenn's exactly right. Now they're desperate to try to cleanse their own hands because they need to have credibility going into the Trump years, especially under the awful, evil RFKJ, to tell you when our leaders are misleading us. That's what's happening here. It's infuriating. They have no credibility. No one believes them anymore. No, not those experts who ran these institutions under Joe Biden. I believe public health and the trust in it will resurrect slowly now under RFKJ, at HHS, under Bhattacharya, at NIH, and under McCary at FDA. I believe it will resurrect, but it's going to take some time. And by the way, the election of President Trump was a middle finger to all these institutes too. In part, it was America saying, F you and what you did to us. You lied to us over the most consequential things affecting our lives, our health care, our loved ones dying and our ability to see them, our children and their wellness in schools, the masking on toddlers nonstop. F you. You're all fucking fired. All of you fired. So it's like it's all baked in. And now the New York Times has to try to whitewash what it did so you'll believe it when it tells you that Kennedy's evil and you need to trust them. You need to trust the Times. I just want to go back for a second. Just give me 3 minutes on this, okay? Because the Times comes to this realization in, what are we in now? March of 2025. It's literally been 5 years since these lies were told. And I went back just to see, it was June of 21 that we had on our show Josh Rogan, who worked at the Washington Post, did work at the Washington Post and does, that's fine. To their credit, they employ Josh, but he wrote a book on his own that took a dive into this. And he did some articles in the Post also raising questions about whether this was from a lab and the Wuhan lab and how secure it was, and the so-called Bat Lady there and how she was working with EcoHealth Alliance, which was U.S. government funded, on gain of function research, which is the very same kind of research that caused the coronavirus. And we had him on in June of 21, you guys. It was 1 year into the pandemic. Now we're 4 years post that. And the New York Times is like, oh, we think it was from a lab. We were being misled. How did that happen? How are we so misled? How did all these experts mislead us on EcoHealth Alliance? It's just willful blindness at best on their part. More than likely, it was an active cover-up because they had a vested interest in the messages that were being handed down. They were pro-lockdown. They were pro these over-the-top so-called health procedures, and they didn't want anything undermining the message And just like this accidentally happening, could accidentally happen to anyone, anywhere, worked with their narrative. And plus, they couldn't have their experts undermined in any part of the message. If Fauci was wrong about this being a naturally caused virus, then he could be wrong about masks. He could be wrong about distancing. He could be wrong about lockdowns and school closures, right? He needed to be upheld at all costs. And by the way, she doesn't even fucking mention Fauci in her piece. She mentions Francis Collins, but she keeps Fauci's fingers squeaky clean, which they're definitely not. All the stuff she mentioned with Francis Collins, Fauci did too. And that's not my opinion. Go back and look. He can come sue me if I'm saying the wrong thing. He is also outed in the Francis Collins emails that Republicans got their hands on in 2022 that showed all of this coordination with the virologist behind the scenes. They both were in there trying to get them to not say lab leak. That was outed by Republicans in 2022. It was January of 2022, after the Republicans found those emails. They had taken over control of the House. They demanded all these emails, and then they released them, that we knew all of this for sure. And I did a talking points memo. Steve, find me the number of that episode if you have time. You can go back and look at it. It was one of the best pieces we ever did on the show. One of the absolute best. And it lays out exactly how they did it, how they whitewashed lab leak right out of the conversation or tried, how they pressured these virologists who the early signs from all of them in emails were saying, holy shit, this looks like us. This looks like lab leak, that we manipulated this thing in the lab. I cannot get past it. Into definitely not a lab. Lab leak theory is racist. It was natural origin. It was all there in the emails, black and white. January 2022. That's 3 years ago, New York Times. Where was your piece then? You spent the next 3 years doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on natural origin. They're so dishonest. And now she wants credit for being the one to, speak truth to power and kind of own how they've been misled. Oh my God, what a lie. She doesn't even go over the Times' sins. Even to say we were mistaken, we were misled. Episode 241, if you want to watch it. Here's a sample of our broadcast in January, I think it was January 14th, 2022.
House Republicans finally got their hands on emails between doctors Fauci, Collins, and some of the world's top virologists. It turns out the very officials who dismissed that as a fringe conspiracy theory in the press were being told exactly the opposite by the world's top experts as early as February 2020. They had studied the virus's genetic makeup, you see, and found the insertion of a genetic sequence that makes a virus more transmissible, a furin cleavage site. One of those scientists on that call with Fauci and Collins, a Brit, Sir Jeremy Farrar, sent a follow-up email to Collins and Fauci the next day, expressing support for the lab leak theory. He relayed the thoughts of two more experts, Robert Gary of Tulane University and Michael Farzan of the Scripps Research Institute. Robert Gary, he said, can't think of a plausible natural scenario. And Farzan was, quote, bothered by the furin site and having a hard time explaining that outside the lab. Christian Andersen of the Scripps Research Institute put the lab leak theory at 60 to 70% likely. 2 days after those scientists went to Collins and Fauci and told them this thing likely came from a lab, 5 of them authored a paper. They did a complete 180, concluding that this virus was clearly, quote, that's a quote, clearly not from a lab and clearly not manipulated by man. Fauci wanted the lab leak theory gone. He later called it a shiny object, reassuring colleagues it would go away. Fauci was behind much of the U.S. funding in China. He admitted approving grants for EcoHealth Alliance, a group that researched coronaviruses in the Wuhan lab. EcoHealth's CEO, Peter Daszak, was one of the first to beg officials to reject the lab leak theory, and tellingly, he warned that the public release of the virus's genetic sequencing would bring, quote, very unwelcome attention.
We laid it all out for you guys. January 2022. If you're a New York Times reader, you're reading it in March 2025 for the first time. I'm sorry, but this is just Such a dereliction. All the stuff. You heard me talking back then about Jeremy Farrar. Here she is in her piece. Spooked, the authors reached out for advice to Jeremy Farrar, now the chief scientist at the World Health Organization. Farrar reviewed their draft and suggested to the authors that they rule out the lab leak even more directly. They complied. She talks about Christian Andersen, who you heard me mention there, and how he wrote internally in these Slack messages between them. The lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario. All the same names. Peter Daszak, who you heard me mention there. She finally has gotten around to all of them. 3 years after this was known, thanks to those House Republicans who got their hands on the emails, who I'm sure she just totally ignored as some of these terrible influencers acting, quote, in terrible faith, using the debate over pandemic origins to attack legitimate beneficial science to inflame public opinion. That's her just trying to justify why they didn't do any of this. She writes, that's also why it might be tempting for these officials or the organizations they represent to avoid looking too closely at mistakes they made, at the ways that while trying to do such a hard job, they might have withheld relevant information and even misled the public. Okay, look at her, still bending over backward to run cover for these people who 100% actively misled us. Fauci is a villain. He's a villain. What sparked Bobby Kennedy's resurrection from the disinformation dozen leader to the health secretary right now? It was his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. Again, who she still doesn't mention when she's going over the list of people who misled us. Even Francis Collins just gets barely a passing mention. It was Fauci. It was Francis Collins. It was the CDC. It was all these virologists who were being controlled by Collins and Fauci. Those are the villains. Still, the New York Times won't admit it. Still, they run cover. She mentions Robert Gary. He's also, I think, referenced in this piece. We had him on this show in 2022. We were stunned he agreed to come on, quite frankly. And here's a bit of how that went.
Well, forgive me, wasn't it just 2 days later that you reversed yourself and said, actually, no, okay, I forget what I said about it coming from a lab. I now say it's
it wasn't really a reversal. I mean, it's what scientists do. You know, we kick around ideas. You know, we have, private conversations. Sometimes you're playing devil's advocate. I mean, that's pretty much what I was doing in that one email. You know,
what happened in those 48 hours? What changed? What did you see?
Well, and looked at the genomes of the viruses more closely.
That, too, is a spicy interview where I really pressed him on his sudden reversal and how much influence Fauci and Collins had over him. It's all spelled out now. I mean, literally, Fauci, I think, has one mention in this piece. One. It's really infuriating. And look, as Glenn said, this isn't like some long infomercial for independent media. It's just the facts of why nobody trusts the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC anymore. They failed us at one of the most consequential moments in U.S. history. They failed us. You don't go out and buy a life jacket when the boat is already sinking, and you don't buy gold when the economy has already collapsed. Clearly, others are heeding this advice as gold hit all-time highs already this year. It's not too late for you, too. And you could have Birch Gold help you diversify into physical gold. Birch Gold specializes in helping you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in physical gold for no money out of pocket. One recent 5-star review said Birch Gold was, quote, knowledgeable, helpful, non-pressure. Get your free info kit on gold by texting the letters MK to the number 989898. There's no obligation, just useful information. With an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau and countless 5-star reviews, just text MK to 989898 and let the experts at Birch Gold help you secure your future today with gold. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.